Welcome to History 111, Lecture 43, Radical Reconstruction. At the end of the war, the South was economically devastated. Prices were out of control. In a previous lecture, we discussed how there was 9,000% inflation. Most plantations were unable to operate because their wealth had been tied up in land, slaves, and Confederate bonds. While the land had been destroyed and damaged, the slaves were free, and Confederate bonds were now worthless. So what that means is the owners neither had the capital to employ labor nor access to free labor in the form of slavery, so that means they can't really restart their plantations. Now, where they could actually operate in those rare cases, the transport network was destroyed, which made it difficult or impossible to move goods to market. So, in other words, the old plantation system is something that's not going to be able to be restarted and is no longer practical in the changing circumstances of the post war South. Now, in addition, a lot of former slaves leave the plantations, but they have nowhere to go. They have no food, no money, and no place to be. Large numbers of displaced persons are going to flood the cities, Union military camps, or roam the country. A lot of people went looking for their relatives who have been sold. So there's an attempt by people to find their relations and to reunite families, and society in general is just in complete disorder within the South. Now, importantly, we need to understand that there's no single definition of freedom for ex slaves, but the ideas ran for something like one man said, which he defined freedom as the ability to do like a white man, or to the right to establish autonomous communities free from white interference. Now, when it came to white Southerners, what they wanted to be free of was northern interference, and they want local and regional autonomy, and they want white supremacy. And those are conflicting goals. We're looking at freedom for former slaves and for what the South is wanting. These are not going to be compatible ideas. And white Southerners are ultimately, though, going to try to use legal means to continue de facto slavery. They're going to try to continue the exploitation of labor using paid methods. They're going to go ahead and try to take the idea of owning a person out, but continue to get that free, cheap labor. At the end of the war, the southern states that seceded were not represented in Congress and had to be readmitted. And what secession had meant was that the Republicans had gained almost complete control of the government. And during the war, they're going to use that to pursue a number of programs that benefit business, banking, and northern regional interests. Now, there's a recognition by Republicans that bringing the largely Democrat South back in can undo these. And some Republicans also were committed to the idea that the Southern way of life needed to be destroyed and a new South needed to be remade in its place. So radical Republicans begin to believe that many white Southerners should also be punished in some form, and they really want to basically stack the deck by granting voting rights to some and stripping it for others. And what they want to try to do is ensure a continued Republican majority in Congress after the states are readmitted. Now, there's a very different vision about how to go forward from Lincoln and from the radical Republicans. Radical Republicans tend to favor programs that benefit ex-slaves at the expense of the planter class and are looking at things like that, but Lincoln believed that political reunification was the priority. We should bear in mind that some Republicans were favoring things like confiscating land and giving it to freedmen, and others are looking at things like breaking political control. But Lincoln is going to go ahead and look at bringing the Union back together as goal number one, dealing with freedmen and what their needs are as goal number two. So Lincoln's going to go ahead and bring some states back into the Union during the war by offering very lenient terms. Now, what Lincoln was asking for readmission was for 10% of the voters to pledge loyalty to the Union, and those who took that loyalty oath could be involved in setting up the states' governments, and for those states to guarantee rights in some form for freedmen, and Congress is going to go ahead and refuse to recognize governments that were set up in this way. Now, the Wade-Davis bill is going to be introduced into Congress, where they say the majority must be loyal. Former Confederate leaders and military officers are not going to be allowed to vote. That under the Wade-Davis bill, emancipation must be accepted. The South has to officially repudiate its war debt, so in other words, it has to declare all of those Confederate bonds to be void and that no one will ever be paid for them. And they also have to have some level of rights for freedmen, but that's going to be really up to each state. Now, Lincoln's death is going to kill his plan and radicalize a lot of moderates. So Johnson is going to become president with Lincoln's death, and he was Lincoln's vice president basically because he was a Southern politician that sided with the Union. Now, he was, for all intents and purposes, a Democrat. Johnson was not well liked, had a pretty abrasive policy, and he's going to formulate his own restoration plan, he calls it. His plan is similar to the Wade-Davis bill, but gave amnesty to most Confederates. Now, the rest can apply for presidential pardons, and he starts to put his plan in action while Congress is in recess. When Congress comes back, they refuse to acknowledge and recognize what they call the Johnson governments. And Northern opinion is much more extreme at this stage, and a lot of people are calling for what amounted to revenge. And many people also thought the Wade Davis bill didn't go far enough when it came to rights for freedmen. So when Congress comes back in this session, they take control of the issue, and there's a big fight between Congress and Johnson over issues of black codes. And these were codes that were designed to force freedmen to continue to work on plantations. And Johnson vetoes bills and gets overridden, and there's a cycle of that there. Now, importantly, Congress decides that states to be readmitted will have to accept the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment states that citizenship will be granted for all men born within American territory. And it also importantly says that pardons for Confederates now require the approval of Congress, because Johnson was pardoning people and they didn't care for that, so they're going to take that ability away from him and make it a congressional issue. Now, initially, they don't have enough states supporting it for it to become part of the Constitution, but with it as a condition for readmission, that ensures that each of those southern states that comes back in will vote for it and that it will pass. Now, the 1866 election is going to swing in Republican favor, and radical candidates are going to dominate both houses, which is going to mean they're going to be able to go ahead and expand all of this. And the Reconstruction Acts come in. Now, Tennessee is going to be admitted to the Union by Congress, but the rest of the South is going to be divided into 5 military districts to be governed by a military governor. And within those areas, only qualified voters could participate in government. Under the Reconstruction Acts, that was all adult black males and only white males who had not participated in the rebellion. And what that really guarantees is that this is going to keep a Republican majority in the South in the short term. Now, this Constitution for each new state had to be drafted, and it had to include black suffrage, and they had to form a state government which approved the 14th Amendment. Those are all things that were able to really get through with the shift in power during the 1866 election. Now, 7 out of 10 states are readmitted under that plan by 1868, and then additional conditions are imposed, which is to ratify the 15th Amendment, which Virginia and Texas do in 1869 and Mississippi does in 1870. Now, there are a number of impediments to Congress doing what it wants to do, and Congress is going to propose several bills intended to strip the Supreme Court of certain powers or even abolish it outright. And rather than force the issue, the Supreme Court starts to refuse to hear cases involving Reconstruction, and that really eliminates the threat to Congress's plan there. Now, Johnson himself is not seen as an obstacle to passive legislation because Congress could just simply override his vetoes. But Congress does believe, however, that Johnson will not enforce the legislation, so they take advantage of a minor issue and impeach the president. The Senate goes ahead and holds a trial, but a handful of moderate Republicans block the effort, and Johnson survives impeachment by a single vote. Now, as a result of what Congress was doing, initially the southern governments that were being formed had significant black representation, and in 5 states they actually had a black majority. But as more whites are going to regain votes, Republican majorities are going to depend on the support of white voters, and 2 groups in particular, scalawags and carpetbaggers. Scalawags were Southerners who thought that business development would benefit them personally and were generally hated by other Southerners and seen as something of traitors. Now, carpetbaggers were Northerners who were often former Union soldiers who bought land from broke Southerners and tried to reestablish and restart plantations, and they were also a very hated group within Southern society. Now, Southern Democrats tend to label the new state governments as being fiscally irresponsible and corrupt, but the level of corruption was about the same as the North or as before the war. The difference now was simply in who benefited. Now, deficit spending is going to increase, but that's due to an increase in public services, especially education and poor relief, and these were things that were very much needed during this period of economic chaos. Now, Southern educational reform is going to be driven by the Freedmen's Bureau, and they're going to set up schools for all children and create many new important opportunities for employment. But the white Southern population is going to have 2 reactions. First, they're against this education. They fear that, in their words, it would give freedmen false notions about equality. And they're also going to go ahead and refuse to send their children to school that admit black people. And so that's going to result in de facto segregation. It's a long time before segregation becomes a matter of law in the South, but they're going to go ahead and unofficially do this. And that's going to result in white-only schools and schools that are technically for all races, but in practice are black schools. Now, we should note that the black schools are going to be the only ones that will hire black teachers, and that is an important source of opportunity and employment for the rising black middle class in the South. It's important to note also that when it comes to how the South is going to be reshaped, there were some people who had different ideas about this, and one of the things that happened during the Civil War was there's a large amount of land seized from Confederate leaders, notably what's called the Sherman Reservation, and freemen were given parcels of land from these seizures. Now, Johnson, when he became president, gave in to demand from ex-Confederates, and he stripped those individuals of the land and gave it back to the former owners. Now, even radical Republicans were unsure if the land seizures were legal, so the issue kind of dies after Johnson takes that land back from everybody. As a result, a lot of this land went fallow. There was nobody to work it, nobody had the labor or the resources to get it going. But the Freedmen's Bureau is going to go ahead and issue low interest loans to try to allow a lot of the freedmen to buy that. And black ownership of land went from about 0% pre-war to about 20%. But most of those who had purchased the land in the 1860s had lost it by the 1890s, and that's due to certain business practices we'll be talking about later. The southern plantations cannot be restarted due to a lack of capital, so new land use systems emerge that are based on risk sharing. First is the tenant farmer system, where a tenant would rent small plots of land for a fixed fee. On the other hand, there was sharecropping, where the rent would be paid in a percentage of the crop. So, in other words, if you grew corn, you would have to give 1/3 of the corn, or whatever the percentage was, to the landowner. Now, the advantage of that is if it was a bad crop, well, you still only paid 1/3 or whatever it was of the bad crop, and if it was a good crop, you still paid 1/3 of the big crop. Now, the crop lien system is the other method where merchants are going to extend credit in exchange for payment when the crop is sold. Now, they're often going to sell inferior goods at inflated prices, and that's going to tend to keep farmers in permanent debt because the amount of money they owe to that merchant is something that they're really never able to pay down because they're not able to ever grow enough of a crop to pay off their debt. And the net effect of this is the merchants are going to get rich and the farmers are going to get poorer, but the landowners are going to continue to benefit from the labor of others but they're going to do so at a reduced rate. And it's the crop lien system in particular that's going to lead a lot of these individuals who had bought land in the 1860s to lose it by the 1890s. So what's the big idea? Well, first and foremost, the question of now what? And there's different visions. Congress and Lincoln don't agree, and then Congress and Johnson don't agree, and that goes to the stage of even trying to remove Johnson from office. And some of the big debates involve who gets to vote. The Republicans want to keep the Democrats out of office, and the Democrats want to keep black people out of office. The one thing that's clear within the South is that the plantation system is over, and we see black codes and the first signs of institutional segregation and institutional racism that will characterize the South for years to come. See you in the next lecture.